Our guests today are both in-house. Rushika de Silva is a senior attorney for Southern California Edison down in the Los Angeles area. Mary Catherine Malley is senior corporate counsel for Juniper Networks up in the Silicon Valley area. Both have done time in law firms, and I worked with Mary Catherine back in the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance many moons ago. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So the 10Q process, always very interesting. How much has it evolved since I was in-house 20 years ago? We're about to find out. And so Rushika and Mary Catherine, thanks so much for doing this. So Rushika, who manages the 10Q process at SCE? Is that the nickname you guys typically use internally?
Yeah, we use SCE or Edison as well. It's a subsidiary of Edison International, and we report for both companies. The 10Q process is managed mainly by the financial reporting team, which sits in our controllers organization. They are my direct client, so I work with them very closely to manage the process, to design the process as well, to set up all the meetings and make sure we're scheduling meetings appropriately, having drafts go out based on our controls and procedures.
And Mary Catherine, what about at Juniper?
At Juniper, our process is really managed by our SEC reporting team, which is part of accounting, which is part of the financial organization. And they set the schedule. They send the schedule out to internal and external stakeholders so that we're all aligned from the beginning on that process. And it really doesn't waver at all from the first calendar.
And what about the legal department's role, Mary Catherine? How is it at Juniper?
Right. Well, the legal department has, our role really focuses primarily on the overall 10Q and then specifically on the risk factors and on the legal proceedings and those types of items. SEC reporting owns the MD&A, but we work very closely with them on that. We also have our external counsel reviews every draft, so they are sort of embedded in our process as well.
Rushika, how about at SCE?
So again, I work very closely with controllers on all parts of the 10Q. At the beginning of each quarter, we split up some of our regulatory proceedings between myself and my counterpart in controllers, and we decide who will take the lead role in going out to our subject matter experts and drafting. Legal also owns risk factors, forward-looking statements, disclosure controls and procedures. We also own legal proceedings. And then we work very closely together on, as you can imagine, our wildfire disclosure is mainly owned by legal as well, but we work closely together with controllers on reserves and things of that nature.
It sounds like things haven't changed that much since I was in-house. You know, Lockheed Martin was a international global company like Juniper Networks is. I'd say the controller's office definitely, I imagine, I have not talked to anyone in Lockheed Martin recently about what their process is, that it's evolved somewhat, but the controller's office really led the 10Q process, and I was in more of a support role, including the MD&A. But for the risk factors, definitely legal was heavily involved. So Rushika, what about the typical time frame from start to finish? How long does that take?
So I would say that we really kick off about a month before the end of the quarter. So for second quarter, June 30th close, I would say we kick off first week of June, starting to reach out to SMEs for updates. And we have a very, very early draft go out just to our CFO, controller, GCs, just to kind of get a flavor for what they're thinking in the second week of June for the second quarter. And then we generally file a month after quarter end. So a little earlier than the deadline for a large accelerated filer, usually June, I think July 28th, we filed for the second quarter this year.
And I bet you're happy to file it as early as you can so you can be done with it.
Yes, and after the audit committee sees it, I want a moratorium on anything material happening. So I really like getting it off our plate.
So Mary Catherine, is the process any different for your company?
Yeah, it's very similar. I would say that our difference is that we file a little bit later. Rushika So the SCE files on the same day, files their Q on the same day as the 8K. We don't do that. We may in the future, may move to that. We start with as SCE does, starts with a draft 0, basically that goes out to our external stakeholders and gets comments from EY, our external auditor, on footnote disclosure and the like. And then we go through 3 drafts internally, with the 3rd draft going to the audit committee in its essentially final form for sign off and edits. So our process is quite similar. We start our Q process probably the day after close, and we file a few days after, about a week after earnings.
I mean, that's pretty interesting that you know exactly how many number of drafts you're going to have from quarter to quarter, that's sort of a standardized thing. That's pretty smart.
Yeah, we have
5th draft.
We have 3 drafts going out. We have 1 draft, which is, we call a prelim draft, which I would say is like her draft 0. It has no numbers in it because it goes out before close. And then the 1st draft goes out generally about 10 days into the month. And an audit committee draft goes out 2.5 weeks-ish. 2.5 to 3 weeks, I would say, into the quarter, about a week before we file generally.
So Mary Catherine, what would you say are the trickier parts of this process for the in-house lawyer? Which parts do you might like the least?
Right, well, I think that flows perfectly from what we talked about in terms of the timing. Really the trickiest part for legal and our company is the risk factors, because our business is evolving daily. And because we're manufacturing all over the world and there's, impacts, whether it's COVID, that we're dealing with at this time, or tariffs or other sort of international events going on that impact our supply chain or impact our transportation or what have you, or our employees, then, we need to account for those changes in our risk factors. So we're constantly reaching out to all of our internal stakeholders, our subject matter experts, and reviewing those 10 Qs and considering what else is out there. And we do go to our outside counsel when events are evolving around the world and making sure that we're in line with what other companies are considering throughout, even before we start that 10Q process. So I think that's really the trickiest part, is managing the risks, knowing what the risks are, and being able to quantify or qualify them in our risk factors.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of in-house people about, killing a risk factor, and it seems like they almost never die. And if anything, you might reduce the size of some and combine them, but it's so hard to actually kill a risk factor because you're always making sure there's some CYA in your documents.
Right.
Rushika, what about for you? What's tricky?
I would say the trickiest parts for me in-house have been really events happening close to filing. Our material could be material that we want to disclose, and really getting all the stakeholders together and getting language that's appropriate into the document and having it reviewed when it's a last-minute event has been very tricky. Generally speaking, if it's a normal process, I would say just balancing everyone's interests. There's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of different opinions, a lot of different desires to meet in terms of what they want to disclose, how much they want to disclose, and just striking a balance it can be very tricky when you have a lot of masters.
I agree.
So Rushika, what type of form check do you do?
I actually am slightly neurotic and run a complete form check myself every quarter. I have found things that I wasn't going to include during a form check. For example, a few quarters ago, I needed to disclose an environmental proceeding. That isn't material to Edison at all. 103, I believe, has environmental proceedings threshold of $100,000 for potential fines and penalties. Wasn't on top of mind at all for me. And had I not run a form check, I wouldn't have caught that. So I do run a form check every quarter. I also have one of my analysts perform one, mostly for training purposes. And I think having two eyes on it is always a good thing. And then PwC, our external auditors, have a gap checklist that controllers performs. That is a more of a high-level form check for the first part of the document, but so we have more than one form check going on. I also check our certifications every quarter, myself personally, to make sure the signature pages are in the document that is getting filed.
Yeah, I find the legal proceedings section to be one of the most difficult to grapple with, because there are some gray areas. People are more sensitive about the disclosure, conservative, because you don't want to give away your strategies. You don't want to give anything away to the other side. And so in making my Vid-Guide on that topic, definitely sweat. I was like, is this right? Am I, I'm not giving legal advice. And I felt that way at the corporatecounsel.net too, right in that end. It's scary. It's scary. Mary Catherine, do you perform a form check?
We do, and I was talking to Rushika, and we were comparing notes on that. And one of the interesting things is as I mentioned previously, is our outside counsel is really embedded in our process. So they are doing a form check, and our SEC reporting team also does a detailed form check, as well as our auditors. So I think we're looking at the form from many different angles, but we are covering all of those bases. And again, on the certifications, I'll typically email early in the process. I'll email our outside counsel and just confirm there isn't any change. Check that myself in the certifications, because legal is required to obtain all the signatures.
I just have to ask this question. When you're doing a form check, you literally have a checklist and you're actually using your pen and checking it off as you go, or?
I usually write down all of the requirements. I look at the form, write down all of the requirements, and then check them off as I go through the rules, just like a first-year associate.
Yeah. Brock and I, from our SEC days, we're used to, constantly form checking. Sometimes I think we had SK memorized more often than not. So I think I have some of those vestiges, but I also do have them right alongside. Just bring it up.
Yeah, I hear you're going to get a little bout of old man storytelling, but when I first got to CorpFin in the late 80s, my branch chief gave me the set of CCHs with the SK items and said, here, read this for my first week, literally reading the rules, verbatim, which you learn nothing. It's lucky that we had office mates back then, because I really relied on my office mate to teach me, to get me started and learn how to learn, because you just can't read the rules, especially they're not written in plain English. There's no way you would ever understand it just by reading the rules and trying to understand.
That's funny, because a partner gave me the California Corporations Code my first day and told me to read it.
They're already trying to push you out on the first day. Exactly. So Mary Catherine, what about managing the exhibits for the 10Q? How do you work with the exhibit index?
Well, it's interesting. We just had a meeting last week about our process on exhibits, because we found that, is our process good enough, right? So I think one of the things we're always doing is looking at our process. And when we just had turnover of one staff member, and then without that staff member, we said, hey, this person used to do something that was valuable. What's our process? And so we put that down a little bit more clearly. Is we have an internal contracts management team that's always gathering all material agreements prior to quarter end. So we work with them to check on what they've learned in terms of what they've gathered. And then we have also in terms of our risk factors, because Juniper is such a big company, there are not very many agreements that are material. And often the material agreements are also part of the risk factors. So those risk factors go out to the lawyers who work on that particular contract to confirm that there are no new amendments or changes to that. And then we also work with our stock administration team on whether there are any benefit plans, it's mostly in connection with our acquisitions that no longer have outstanding shares. And then we're pulling those plans out. So really, and then again, we mentioned about the certifications and signatures. So it's the SEC reporting team, our contracts administration team, legal, that starts early and considering the exhibits, the certifications. And then again, if we're filing an S8, that we're including that S8 in the exhibit index. So updating it.
Is it any different, Rushika, for Edison?
Yes and no. I think that we manage our material contracts part of the exhibit, more with our 8K processes. So we have educated people on what's required, and to the extent that material contracts are being entered into that need to be filed. So ones that are not ordinary course, generally, with some exceptions, we're getting the information while they're in negotiations before they get executed, and then we file our 8Ks. They don't happen very often, again, because a lot of our material contracts are ordinary course and are not required to be filed. So then I do have, as part of our process, someone looking at all of the 8Ks that have been filed to make sure we catch those all in the 10Q. And then we go out to certain subject matter experts, especially in the comp area, to make sure that any other contracts that have been terminated or entered into are caught up in the 10Q. And then the form check, again, cross-checks to make sure that everything has been covered.
And if you want to learn 15 minutes more about how to update the 10K and 10Q index, there's a vid guide on that, the link to which is below. So thank you so much, Mary Catherine and Rushika. That was very educational and comforting. You know, things have not changed too much, but there is more form checking perhaps than I expected. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome, Rob.